Okay, let's unpack this. We've all seen the headlines, right? Red meat and cancer.
Oh, yeah, all the time.
It sounds, well, pretty scary. Maybe even like a dietary death sentence, depending on which article you happen to read.
Exactly. But as physicians, when we actually dig into the research itself,
Yeah,
it's uh it's rarely that simple, is it?
not at all. So the big question is, what does the vast, complex body of scientific evidence really tell us?
And that's really the heart of our mission today. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Right.
We've got, well, quite a serious stack of research papers here. Major reviews, meta-analyses,
Mhm.
the whole lot.
Yep.
And our goal isn't to preach dietary doctrine. Absolutely not. It's to cut through the noise, and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight specifically for you, our listener.
Think of us as your personal medical guides, maybe,
Yeah.
navigating this really intricate literature on the relationship between red meat consumption and various cancers.
Exactly. We're not here to dictate your dinner plate choices. Not at all. We're here to help you understand what the research seems to indicate, why scientists think these links might exist, and, crucially, just how confident the evidence actually allows us to be.
Because you shared these sources with us, you want to get informed quickly and accurately, and that's precisely what we're going to try and help you do today.
And the crucial first step when looking at this research,
Right.
we've got to make sure we're all talking about the same thing.
Definitions, right. Always definitions.
Always. Because when studies say meat, they often have quite specific definitions. According to big players like the International Agency for Research on Cancer, that's the IRRC,
Right.
and the World Cancer Research Fund American Institute for Cancer Research, WCRFA-ICR. Red meat is generally defined as unprocessed mammalian muscle meat.
Okay, so that's your beef, veal, pork, lamb, basically anything that mooed or oinked or
Well,
bad.
pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
Unprocessed muscle meat from mammals.
Gotcha. And processed.
And processed meat is meat that's been transformed somehow, maybe through salting, curing, fermentation, smoking, or other processes they use to enhance flavor or preserve it.
So that's where you get your bacon, ham, sausages, hot dogs, lots of deli meats, that kind of thing.
Exactly, that stuff. And it's worth noting, just quickly, while these are the standard definitions,
Mhm.
some studies might tweak them slightly. Maybe they include pork in red meat in one study or lump things differently in another,
Yeah.
which just, well, it adds another layer of complexity we have to navigate.
Right, okay. Definitions clarified. So armed with those, let's look at the types of research that actually give us these insights. What kind of studies are we wading through here?
Well, a significant portion of the evidence, particularly the strong associations we often hear about in headlines, comes from observational studies.
Good.
These are primarily large cohort studies. That's where researchers follow huge groups of people for years, sometimes even decades. They watch what they eat and track who gets sick.
Tracking over time.
And we also look at case control studies. That's where they compare people with a specific cancer to similar people without it and ask them, about their past diets.
So they're observing real-world eating habits over time, which I guess is messy but powerful because it's happening in the general population, right?
It is messy, but yeah, it reflects real life. And much of the headline-grabbing findings come from taking dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these individual studies and pooling their results together.
The meta-analyses.
Exactly. Meta-analysis. They're like combining all those individual snapshots into one giant panorama.
Yeah.
It helps to see the overall trends and strengthens the statistical power to detect these associations.
Associations. Not necessarily cause and effect, but associations.
That's the key word. These studies can tell us people who eat more of X tend to have a higher risk of Y. Tend to.
All right, okay. Let's dive into the findings then. Given this stack of research, which cancers show the strongest associations with red meat consumption, let's start with one that maybe isn't the first one people think of.
You might be surprised, actually. Gastric cancer, so stomach cancer.
Stomach cancer, okay.
That's one where the link appears particularly strong in some of these analyses. One meta-analysis we look at found a pooled relative risk of 1.72.
Wow, 1.72?
Yeah, for those with the highest red meat consumption compared to the lowest.
So for the highest consumers, the risk was, what, 72% higher compared to the lowest consumers in that particular study? That's a significant number.
It is.
That's a definite nugget of insight right there. Stomach cancer isn't the one plastered on all the billboards, maybe, but the association here seems quite notable.
It absolutely is. And another meta-analysis, this one specifically focusing on gastric cancer, back this up, found similar high relative risks, 1.72 for red meat and 1.28 for processed meat, again comparing highest versus lowest intake.
Okay. Still pretty high for processed, too.
Yeah, and they found a clear dose-response pattern, meaning the more you ate, the higher the risk seemed to go. For every 100 grams per day increase in red meat, the risk went up by about 45%. That's a relative risk of 1.45.
100 grams a day increase.
Okay. And for processed meat, just 50 grams per day, that's like one hot dog or a couple slices of bacon, increased the risk by 24%. Relative risk 1.24.
Wow.
And what's really fascinating here, another key insight perhaps, is that the red meat association was still significant even after they adjusted for H. pylori infection.
H. pylori. The bacteria is strongly linked to stomach ulcers and cancer, right?
Exactly. It's a major known risk factor for stomach cancer. So even accounting for that, the red meat link remained.
That is fascinating. So it's not just that high meat eaters might also have higher H. pylori rates. There seems to be something else potentially going on with the meat itself.
Seems that way, according to that research.
Okay, stomach cancer, strong association noted. What about colorectal cancer? That's the one everyone seems to hear about most often.
Colorectal cancer, yeah. That includes colon and rectal cancer. It's definitely the most publicized link. And the evidence for red meat, specifically, is often rated as moderate quality in these evidence grading systems, like GRADE.
Moderate quality. And just quickly, GRADE stands for Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation, something like that.
That's the one. It's a system scientists use to rate how confident they are in a body of evidence. So moderate means they're reasonably confident, but, not absolutely certain. There's still room for other factors.
Got it. Reasonably confident.
Precisely. And the meta-analyses looking at colorectal cancer consistently show increased relative risks tied to high red or processed meat intake, often in the range of, say, 1.17 to 1.28.
Okay, 1.17 to 1.28. So maybe a 17% to 28% relative increase in risk for the high consumers compared to low consumers. How does that sort of translate to a real person's risk?
Well, the UK's NHS study gave a pretty good example. They followed women for a long time and found that those consuming just one serving of red or processed meat daily over 40 years
One serving daily.
had about a 20% increased relative risk of developing colon cancer.
One serving daily for decades, leading to a 20% bump. That helps make the numbers feel a bit more concrete. It's not like a 500% increase, but over a lifetime, for a whole population, that adds up.
It does, statistically speaking, for the population. And here's a nuance which kind of highlights the complexity.
Uh-huh.
Some studies suggest the association might actually vary by the specific type of red meat.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. One study, for instance, found links for lamb and pork, but beef seemed less associated,
Yeah.
or maybe even showed a decreased risk for rectal cancer specifically in some groups they looked at.
Really? Beef showed decreased risk in some cases.
For rectal cancer, in that particular study, yes.
Yeah.
So it's not a perfectly uniform picture, even within the red meat category.
Hmm.
And there's also discussion in the sources about a potential role for something called new 5GC.
New 5GC. What's that?
It's a specific type of sugar molecule. It's found abundantly on the surface of cells in red meat, but not so much in humans or poultry or fish. And the idea is that our immune system might react to this foreign sugar when we eat red meat, causing inflammation, which could potentially contribute to cancer risk over time.
A sugar in meat sparking an immune reaction? That's another surprising potential mechanism. Okay, so we've got notable links for stomach and colorectal cancers. Where else is the research point?
Pancreatic cancer is another one where the evidence for red meat was rated as moderate quality in one source.
Pancreatic. Okay.
Studies link red meat intake to an increased risk there too. And interestingly, one study found this link was particularly noticeable in men.
In men specifically, any ideas why?
Well, they suggested a potential mechanism involving N-nitroso compounds, those things often associated with processed meats, remember?
Right.
The idea is they might get absorbed and reach the pancreas via the bloodstream. And another interesting point, the association seemed possibly stronger in Eastern countries.
Why might that be?
It's speculative, but it possibly hints that cooking methods, which can vary geographically, might play a role in forming some of these risky compounds.
Fascinating. Okay, now, here's where it gets really interesting, maybe, and perhaps counters some common assumptions. What about breast cancer? That's not typically the first cancer people associate with meat, is it?
You're absolutely right. It's definitely not the most publicized link, but several of these sources do show an association.
They do.
Yes. One prospective study, a big one following people over time, linked higher red meat intake to an increased risk of overall cancers. But notably, they found an even higher risk specifically for breast cancer. The hazard ratio was 1.83 for those eating the most red meat versus the least.
Whoa, wait. An HR of 1.83 for breast cancer from red meat. In that study, that's actually a stronger relative association than some of the colorectal numbers we just talked about.
In that specific study, yes, the relative risk increase was quite striking.
That's a genuine surprise. That's a key insight many people probably don't know
It
about.
was a standout finding in that particular study. And a separate meta-analysis, one looking only at breast cancer, found about a 6% higher risk associated with red meat consumption overall,
Okay, 6% overall.
and about a 9% higher risk for processed meat. And the first study we mentioned, the one with the high HR, found this link appeared in both pre- and postmenopausal women.
So, while it might be less discussed publicly, the association with breast cancer is definitely something the research is highlighting. Are there any other cancers showing up with increased risk in these sources?
Yes, several others pop up in the analyses with increased risk associations.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Esophageal cancer showed relative risks around 1.17, 1.33. Nasopharyngeal carcinoma, that's cancer in the upper part of the throat behind the nose, had an RR of 1.46.
Okay.
And non-Hodgkin lymphoma, or NHL, showed an RR of 1.28. That was all noted in one comprehensive analysis.
Right.
And if you look at the graphical data presented in some sources, it also suggests an increased risk per consumption increment for endometrial cancer of the uterine lining and bladder cancer.
Wow.
And zooming out even further, looking at the really big picture, overall cancer mortality, so dying from any cancer, was also linked to increased red meat consumption in some analyses.
That's quite a list, covering a pretty wide range of cancer types. But just as crucial for getting the whole picture, what did the research not find consistently? Are there cancers where the evidence in these sources suggests no significant association?
Absolutely, and this is really important to keep in mind. The research isn't painting all cancers with the same brush when it comes to meat intake. Not at all.
Good point.
Some studies found no significant association between red meat consumption and the risks of, let's see, acute myeloid leukemia, AML, chronic lymphocytic leukemia small, lymphocytic lymphoma, SLL, glioma, which is a type of brain tumor,
Okay.
kidney cancer, leukemia overall, hepatocellular carcinoma, that's primary liver cancer, cancers of the oral cavity and eoropharynx, so mouth and throat, or ovarian cancer.
So quite a few where the link just wasn't showing up significantly in these reviews.
Exactly. For those specific cancers in the studies reviewed, a clear link wasn't established.
And you mentioned prostate cancer earlier. Some large studies didn't find an association there either.
That's right. Some major studies did not find a significant link between red meat intake and prostate cancer risk.
Didn't you also say something about potential mechanisms involving cooking?
Ah, yes. Just to make things complicated. Potential biological mechanisms involving those cooking carcinogens, the HDAs,
Right, heterocyclic amines.
were discussed in the context of how they might affect prostate cancer cells in laboratory settings in one source. But the large population studies didn't consistently show that eating more red meat led to more prostate cancer.
Huh. So the lab work suggests a possibility, but the population data isn't clearly backing it up yet.
Pretty much. It really underscores how complex this all is and how the picture varies greatly depending on the specific cancer type you're looking at. A key insight here is definitely that the risks aren't uniform across the board.
Okay, so we've got these associations strong for some cancers like stomach and colorectal, moderate for others like pancreatic and breast, maybe less clear or absent for others. What could possibly be causing these links? Let's try and pull back the curtain on the how, the potential mechanisms.
Right. The science points to several potential biological pathways, often involving compounds that are either naturally present in the meat or formed during processing, or, importantly, created when the meat is cooked, especially at high temperatures.
Okay, give us the rundown on these potential culprits.
One key suspect is heme iron.
The iron in meat.
Exactly. It's the type of iron that's abundant in red meat and very easily absorbed by our bodies. Now, it's essential for nutrition. We need iron. Sure. But some sources suggest that in the gut, heme iron can act as a catalyst. It can sort of kickstart chemical reactions that lead to the formation of potentially harmful compounds,
Like what?
like N-nitroso compounds or NOCs, and also products of fat oxidation, basically.
Yeah.
When fats go rancid, compounds like malondialdehyde, MDA, and 4-hydroxynonenal, 4-HNE.
Okay.
This whole idea is often called the heme iron hypothesis and is particularly linked to the development of colorectal cancer in the research.
So something as fundamental and, frankly, necessary as the iron in the meat could, in the gut environment, be part of the story. Interesting. What about the cooking process itself? You mentioned that.
Cooking is a huge factor. When you cook meat, especially red meat, at high temperatures, think grilling, frying, broiling,
Get that nice char.
exactly, that char, it can create compounds called heterocyclic amines, HCAs, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs.
HCAs and PAHs, heard of those?
Yeah, they're pretty well known as carcinogen substances capable of causing cancer. Some studies suggest that specific HCAs, like one called FIP, could potentially promote cell growth and migration in cancers like breast and prostate, at least in lab models.
So how you cook it really matters.
It seems to. And fascinatingly, your individual genetic makeup might influence how well your body handles these compounds.
Also,
It relates to how well your body detoxifies them. There are enzymes involved, like those linked to something called NET2 activity. Some people's enzymes work faster or slower, potentially affecting their individual risk from exposure.
wow. So how you cook it and your own genetic wiring could influence the risk. That's a profound layer of complexity, isn't it?
It really is.
Okay, what else is on the list of potential mechanisms?
N-nitroso compounds, NOCs, we mentioned them with heme iron, but they're particularly notorious and are a big reason why processed meats often get highlighted separately.
Because of the curing process.
Exactly. They can be formed from nitrates and nitrites, which are often added to meats during curing for preservation and color, but NOCs can also be formed endogenously. That means inside your own body after you consume meat, especially red meat, partly due to that heme iron effect.
Okay, and where are these NOCs thought to cause problems?
They're strongly linked in the research to gastric cancer, and they're also suspected as potentially playing a role in pancreatic cancer risk.
Which lines up perfectly with the strong gastric cancer associations we talked about earlier.
It does align well, yes. Another potential mechanism involves inflammation.
Ah, the inflammation connection.
Hmm.
Seems to pop up everywhere in chronic disease.
It really does. Some research suggests that compounds from red meat or the reactions they trigger in the body, maybe those lipid oxidation products or HCAs activating inflammatory pathways, or even that new 5-GC sugar triggering an immune response we mentioned.
Right.
All of these could potentially contribute to chronic low-grade inflammation. And we know that chronic inflammation is definitely linked to cancer development over the long term.
So it sounds like a whole cocktail of potential issues, the iron, the cooking chemicals, the processing additives, inflammation. Are there other dietary factors tied into this whole picture?
Yeah, the sources also touch on the broader dietary context. It's often noted that sometimes high red meat consumption goes hand in hand with other dietary patterns,
Like what?
like maybe eating fewer fruits, vegetables, and fiber,
Yeah.
and perhaps consuming higher amounts of overall fat and calories. And these patterns themselves have their own health implications,
Yeah.
obviously. Specific compounds like saturated fat, or even just high intake of animal protein itself, or a fatty acid called phytanic acid, have been tentatively implicated in some cancers, like NHL for phytanic acid.
Okay.
And also, conditions that are sometimes linked to high meat intake patterns, like type 2 diabetes, are also known independent risk factors for certain cancers, like pancreatic cancer.
So it's really hard to untangle, isn't it? It's not just the meat in isolation, but how it fits into the whole diet and even other health conditions someone might have.
Exactly. It's a web of factors.
Is there any glimmer of hope in the research? Maybe ways to potentially mitigate the risk if you do choose to eat meat?
Well, the sources do explore this. It's definitely an area of ongoing research. They mention studies looking into ways to potentially reduce the formation or the biological effects of some of these harmful compounds.
Such as?
Things like adding certain nutrients to the diet. Calcium seems to bind heme iron, potentially reducing NOC formation. Antioxidants like vitamin C and E might help counteract some oxidative damage. And also, simply modifying cooking methods, using lower temperatures, avoiding heavy charring, maybe marinating meat beforehand, which can sometimes reduce HCA formation.
Right. So practical things people could potentially do.
Potentially, yes. It's
Well-
not presented as a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's an active area of study looking for harm reduction strategies.
All right, let's try and zoom out then and bring this all home. With all these findings, these mechanisms, these complexities, what does this actually mean for you, the listener, when you're standing at the butcher counter or looking at a menu?
This is where we get to perhaps the most important nugget of insight of all, and one that's so easily lost in the headlines.
Okay.
The critical distinction between association and causation.
Ah, yes, the cornerstone of interpreting this kind of research.
Absolutely. Most of what we've discussed, those increased risks, they come from observational studies. They show that people who eat more red or processed meat tend to have a higher risk of certain cancers. But showing a tendency, an association, a correlation, that's different from definitively proving that the meat caused the cancer.
Because in observational studies, you just can't perfectly control for everything else going on in a person's life, can you?
Exactly.
Their smoking habits, how much they exercise, their income level, family history, whether they eat lots of vegetables with their meat, or maybe they just eat burgers and fries all the time. It's incredibly difficult to perfectly isolate the effect of just one food.
Precisely. Researchers try really hard, using sophisticated statistical methods to adjust for these other factors, these confounders, but it's never perfect. There might always be something they didn't measure or couldn't fully account for.
Right. And then there's that concept of relative versus absolute risk, which can sound kind of confusing, but is so vital for putting these percentages into perspective.
Absolutely crucial. When you hear about, say, a 20% increased risk from an observational study, that's a relative risk.
Okay.
It tells you how much more likely the high meat group is to get the cancer compared to the low meat group. But, and this is the important part, if the original baseline risk of that particular cancer is actually very, very low to begin with.
Which it often is for many cancers in the general population.
Right. Then a 20% relative increase might translate into only a tiny absolute increase in the actual number of cases. Maybe just a few extra cases per 1,000 people, even over many years.
So a scary sounding percentage increase might not actually translate to a massive change in your personal likelihood of getting that cancer, especially if you're starting from a pretty low risk baseline anyway. That definitely reframes things, doesn't it?
It really does. It's about understanding the scale of the potential risk. And now we need to introduce the gold standard for trying to prove cause and effect.
All right.
Randomized controlled trials, or RCTs.
Right. The experiments where people are randomly assigned to different groups.
Exactly. People are randomly put into, say, a group told to continue their usual meat intake and another group told to reduce their meat intake. Randomization helps to balance out all those confounding factors we worried about in the observational studies.
Okay, so what did the RCTs show? Did reducing meat lower cancer risk in these trials?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting and maybe controversial. When researchers systematically reviewed the available RCTs that looked specifically at whether lower versus higher red meat intake affected actual cancer outcomes,
Yeah.
they found the evidence for effects on cancer mortality and cancer incidence was rated as very uncertain.
Very uncertain. Okay, wow. That sounds like a major puzzle piece that doesn't quite seem to fit with the observational data showing those clear associations we discussed earlier. How do we wrap our heads around that discrepancy?
That discrepancy is, frankly, a huge topic of debate and ongoing research in the nutrition science community.
I bet.
The review of the RCTs suggested that reducing red meat consumption by about, say, 1 to 3 servings per week might have little or no effect on major cancer outcomes like mortality or incidence. But, and this is also critical, they stressed that the overall certainty or quality of this RCT evidence was low.
Low certainty even from the RCTs. Why would that be?
Well, RCTs on diet are incredibly hard and expensive to do well, especially for long-term outcomes like cancer. Maybe the trials weren't long enough to see an effect develop. Maybe they weren't large enough. Maybe people didn't actually change their diets as much as they were supposed to. There are lots of potential reasons.
So it leaves us in a tricky spot, doesn't it? Observational studies show consistent associations rated moderate quality for some cancers, but the RCTs, which are theoretically better for causation, show very uncertain effects, and the evidence quality there is low.
Exactly. It highlights that the science isn't settled and simple. Are the observational studies maybe overestimating the risk because of that residual confounding we can't fully control for? Or are the RCTs just not adequate yet to capture a real, but perhaps modest, effect over a long time frame? Scientists are still actively trying to figure this out.
And as you mentioned with the grade system earlier, the certainty or quality of the evidence really does vary depending on the specific cancer type, ranging from very low for some up to moderate for others like colorectal or pancreatic in some assessments. So we're just more confident about the link for some cancers than others, and we have to be honest about that underlying uncertainty.
Precisely. And finally, it's essential to remember the other side of the coin. Red meat isn't just a source of potential risk. It's also a source of important nutrients.
Right, the nutritional benefits.
Yeah, high-quality protein, easily absorbed heme iron, which we need despite the potential gut issues, zinc, selenium, vitamin B12, important stuff. So dietary decisions really involve balancing these potential risks, which, as we've seen, seem to vary by the type of meat, the amount eaten, how it's cooked, and the specific cancer outcome against these nutritional benefits, all within the context of your entire diet and lifestyle.
It truly is a complex web. It seems like navigating this uncertainty is just part of the process when looking at nutrition science. What are some of the key limitations that keep the science from giving us a perfectly clear, simple answer on this?
Well, as we've touched on, dietary studies are notoriously difficult. First, just measuring what people eat is hard. People aren't always great at remembering or accurately reporting everything they consumed, which leads to measurement error.
The food frequency questionnaires and diet diaries, they're not perfect.
Not perfect, no. It's also really hard in many studies to cleanly separate the effects of unprocessed red meat versus processed meat, because people often eat both, sometimes in the same meal.
Good point. Hard to isolate.
And, as we've hammered home, the observational design of most of the studies means we just can't definitively prove cause and effect. Unmeasured confounding those hidden factors is always a possibility.
Yeah.
These inherent limitations really explain why different studies can sometimes yield slightly different results and why the overall picture remains complex and, well, debated.
Okay. Let's try and bring it all together then, a final summary.
Okay. In summary, there's a large body of observational research, often synthesized in meta-analyses, which shows statistical associations between higher consumption of red meat and, perhaps even more so, processed meat, and an increased relative risk for several specific types of cancer.
And the most notable ones seem to be gastric, colorectal, maybe breast, and pancreatic cancer, among a few others.
Correct. And the potential biological mechanisms researchers are exploring involve things like heme iron's effects in the gut, carcinogens formed during high-temperature cooking or from processing additives like N-nitroso compounds,
Yeah.
and potentially chronic inflammation.
However, and this is a big however, the science is nuanced. The certainty or quality of this observational evidence varies, maybe from very low to moderate, depending on the specific cancer type being looked at.
Right. And critically, when we look at the results from randomized controlled trials, which are generally considered the gold standard for proving cause and effect, the evidence regarding the actual effect of reducing red meat intake on major cancer outcomes like mortality or incidence is currently rated as very uncertain.
Suggesting potentially little to no effect in those trials, although importantly, the quality and certainty of that RCT evidence is considered low as well. So uncertainty on both sides in a way.
Exactly. It's a complex picture with ongoing debate. So the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, is hopefully that understanding this complex, sometimes conflicting science empowers you to make more informed choices about your own diet.
It's not really about labeling a single food as absolutely good or bad in isolation, is it?
Not at all. It's much more about appreciating the potential risks and benefits within the much larger context of your overall dietary pattern, your cooking methods, your lifestyle, and even your individual factors like genetics or baseline health.
So here's maybe a final provocative thought to leave you with. Considering the strength of the associations we see in these large observational studies versus the uncertainty that remains in the randomized trials, considering the varying certainty of evidence for different cancers, all those plausible biological mechanisms, and the role of individual factors, how do we as individuals just trying to eat healthily and even as a society trying to develop sensible public health guidance, how do we decide how to translate these scientific associations with all their varying levels of certainty into actual personal dietary choices or official recommendations?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's precisely the question that keeps researchers busy around the clock, designing new studies, debating the evidence, and makes diving into topics like this a continuous, fascinating, and frankly, never-ending exploration.
Indeed it does. Stay curious. Keep asking those questions. And thank you for diving deep into this really complex topic with us today.
We hope this deep dive helped you understand the science and the uncertainties around red meat and cancer a little better.
Yeah, and if it sparks some thoughts or maybe clarified things for you, please do share it with someone else you think might find it interesting or helpful.
And please make sure you subscribe to the show. That way you won't miss future deep dives where we tackle other complex topics and try to make sense of them together.